As a nation, we have so many social and economic problems. Constant political tension, racial division, and social unrest that leave us weaker and more vulnerable. So many of us are just trying to survive, living paycheck to paycheck, amassing debt, struggling to pay our bills, and the feeling of excessive taxes. Our communities are dealing with lack of investment in both physical and human infrastructure, and our small businesses are struggling. And while we have the ability to solve these problems, we're not doing it. And we are not prioritizing the policies that prioritize people. Hello, my name is Delman Coates, founder of the Our Money campaign, with an agenda that is going to change the way we think about our future as a nation, a future where no person or community is left behind, and a future that brings us together rather than pulls us apart. How many times have we been told that the things that we need are unaffordable? When the country bails out banks and corporations or gives tax cuts to the rich, no one talks about the deficit or the national debt. And when we go to war, no one ever says, where's the money gonna come from? But all of a sudden, when it comes to money for the things that we need, the country is broke and needs to tighten its purse strings.
We need to cut spending.
The burden of debt is serious and it's hard on folks.
We can't keep mortgaging our children's future to China.
We must reduce the deficit.
It will blow a hole in the budget.
You really can't spend more than what you take in.
The truth is that the federal government's budget doesn't work like a household that needs revenue first in order to spend. The U.S. government issues or creates the money for the things that we need. It doesn't need to go out and borrow or tax the public in order to obtain the money it spends. We all saw this firsthand when the U.S. government approved $5 trillion worth of spending in response to COVID-19. The government didn't tax millionaires and billionaires in order to obtain that money. We didn't send a bill to Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Oprah Winfrey, Jay-Z or Beyonce for that matter. We didn't send a bill to people making over $400,000 in order to fund the stimulus. And we didn't borrow it from China either. Instead, the federal government responsibly created the money with keystrokes on a computer. And weeks later, people started receiving checks in the mail. So this idea that the federal government's ability to spend is limited by how much revenue it generates is wrong. As long as prices remain stable and spending doesn't cause inflation, the federal government can and should responsibly create all the money we need to address our greatest social and economic challenges. The way the federal government creates money for the things that we need is by deficit spending. We're accustomed to thinking of a deficit as something negative, and for a household or a business or state or local government, a deficit is negative. But remember what I said earlier, the federal government's budget doesn't work like that of a household. What that means then is that a deficit for the federal government is not the same as a deficit for a household. In fact, a deficit for the federal government results in a surplus for the American people. Let's see if I can illustrate it for you. If I pay you $100 for a job and I tax back $50 from you, I now have a $50 deficit because I spent more than I brought back in revenue. You, however, have $50 left over, and that $50 is now your surplus. And you can use that money for the things that you need. You can purchase gas with that money, you can buy lunch with that money, and so my deficits result in a surplus for you. Well, deficit spending by the federal government works just like that. When it spends more than it generates in tax revenue, what's left is a surplus for us. And since the federal government created the money that it initially spent, it's really not a deficit as we commonly think. So that big national debt clock in Manhattan is not really a debt in the conventional sense, being passed down to future generations as we're commonly told by politicians. Instead, it's a reflection of how much money the government has invested in public priorities. And that's a good thing. While we've been told what we can't do and what we can afford, the truth is that we can afford it. We can responsibly create money to address our greatest needs, to raise the economic floor in America so that people don't have to go without the basic necessities of life. So that household budget framework that we've been told, the one causing gridlock in Washington because politicians can't agree on where to find the money, is flawed. And it's preventing us from fixing what is broken in America, like addressing climate change, developing a 21st century transit system, and creating good-paying jobs that will strengthen families, reduce crime, and keep people out of prison. But to do it, we must reject the myth that the federal government needs to find money in order to spend money, because it doesn't. The road to a more equitable and sustainable future begins with 3 bold yet achievable policies. The first is a federal job guarantee, which would provide a dignified job with benefits for every American who wants one. It's necessary because right now, policymakers in Washington generally define full employment as 4 to 5% unemployment. That means that even in a good economy, there will always be tens of millions of unemployed people. A federal job guarantee would end involuntary unemployment by providing jobs for all those that the private sector is unable or unwilling to employ. And since a federal job guarantee is federally funded and administered at the state and local level, the policy would greatly benefit state and local governments whose budgets are already strained. It would raise wages, provide economic security for American families, and end racial scapegoating due to labor competition. One study shows that a job guarantee would boost GDP by over $500 billion a year, add more than 19 million private and public service jobs, and improve state-level government budgets by a total of $53 billion per year. Another great benefit of a job guarantee is that it's an automatic stabilizer, meaning that the spending for the policy is automatic, and we won't have to keep going back and forth to Congress seeking additional funding every time it's needed, as we do currently with stimulus spending. Second, the American people deserve free public health care. Decent quality health care should be a right and not a privilege in the wealthiest nation in the world. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services highlights that millions lack health insurance in the U.S., and the uninsured are disproportionately Black or Latino. As a nation, we have the means to provide quality health care to every American free at the point of service, with no networks, no premiums, no deductibles, and no co-pays. It is unconscionable in America that a lack of health insurance for citizens causes people to die and to have to go into medical debt just because they get sick. If individuals desire to keep their private insurance, that's fine, but we deserve quality, free public health care. Third is education reform and relief. We are calling for federal funding of public education, pre-K through post-secondary education, including funding for minority-serving institutions and vocational and trade schools. We know that funding public education based on state and local taxes creates a 2-tiered system of education in America, one for the haves and the other for the have-nots. We can significantly reduce the funding disparities that plague public education, reduce class sizes, improve facilities, and provide better pay for our well-deserving teachers by funding public education through federal dollars rather than state and local dollars. We are also calling for the abolition of student loan debt. It will enable our students to fulfill their dreams and pursue careers without being burdened by such oppressive debt. Rather than paying off school loans, they could invest in themselves and build wealth for their future. Research from the Center for Law and Social Policy reveals that canceling student loan debt would help close the racial wealth gap, providing greater equity amongst all students. The major takeaway is that our national capacity to spend on the things that we need is much greater than we've been led to believe. When the federal government responsibly deficit spends on the things that we need, we are able to solve some of our greatest social and economic challenges. And with more public spending, households will have less debt, less stress, and more peace of mind. Families would have greater job security, and students could receive an education that doesn't place them in economic bondage for the rest of their lives. Households would not be overburdened with taxes, and local and state governments would be able to better provide for their residents with greater support from the federal government. In turn, businesses would thrive because the American people will have less private debt and more money to purchase the goods and services they need. It's a win-win scenario for everyone, one in which there's an expanded social safety net, reduced household debt, stable neighborhoods, shared prosperity, and an economy that works for us rather than against us. Failure to adequately invest in these priorities makes our economy a lot like a game of musical chairs, forcing the public and those who represent us to compete over limited jobs, healthcare, and schools. We can do better. We must do better. Our future as a nation depends upon it. Learn more about our campaign and the ways you can get involved by visiting our website, ourmoneyus.org. Organize in your community for the policies advocated here and vote for elected leaders who support them. It's time that we prioritize the policies that prioritize people.